Good morning. My name is Jodie Scheu, and I'll be presenting relevant research, opinions, and data relating to licensing for sex workers. The No Excuse for Abuse campaign, which is commonplace in all doctors' offices, hospitals, government, and Centrelink agencies, is now considered to be the standard of behaviour and protection that is expected from those professions and the general public without question or contest. However, this is not the case for sex work. Since the No Excuse for Abuse campaign launched between 2016 and 2017, there has been avid and rapid changes in the reporting of violence and the reduction of workplace incidences towards workers, particularly women. But this is not the case for anyone who is or provides a sex work service. Despite social stigmas and attitudes towards sex workers in the industry, sex work as a chosen profession exists, and the majority of the time, sex workers are in the industry by choice. Leaving aside the more sinister and complex issues surrounding the sex work industry, the focus is becoming more streamlined towards legislative changes in Queensland that will see the industry decriminalised and statutory protections implemented for sex work service providers and brothel licence holders. With more and more calls for policy reform, the Queensland Attorney-General, Shannon Fentiman, has referred the state sex work legislation to the Queensland Law Reform Commission and has stated that it's really important that workers in Queensland, no matter what industry that they are in, do not have to choose between working safely and working legally. The Commission is said to provide its final report, including any draft legislation required to give effect to its recommendations to the Attorney-General and Minister for Justice by the 27th of November of 2022. This primary recommendations for decriminalising sex work and making legislative changes. The main topic of discussion, review, and research, for our point of view here, is that sex work is legitimate work deserving of statutory protection, and licensing for brothel owners, holders, and individuals become mandatory, affording them then statutory protection. If successful, brothel owners and individuals will receive legislative safeguards, protections through licensing and regulations. At the moment, brothel license holders and individual sex workers are bound by ambiguous, draconian, and outdated laws. The police should be there to enforce the law, protect vulnerable people in the community, not paint a target on the backs of sex workers and brothels, wasting expensive and valuable police time prosecuting and taking down sex workers. Whilst there is a need for police to report on and storm the buildings looking for sex trafficking, slaving operations, and money laundering fronts for corrupt licensees, there seems to be an ongoing revenue-raising exercise and attitude regarding police powers that aims at sex workers and brothels who are an easy target. The laws governing prostitution, named the Prostitution Act of 1999, means that the Queensland Police Service is responsible for investigating unlawful prostitution. The authority actively communicates stakeholder concerns, intelligence, and complaints to the Queensland Police Service. These strict regulations stem from the 1989 Fitzgerald inquiry, which uncovered decades of police corruption that was greatly linked to sex and to the sex work industry and police corruption. At the time, it was considered the best approach to clean up the streets and the brothels and better protect the community. However, these regulations leave many sex workers forced to work illegally, risking their personal health and safety and therefore that of the customer. The requirements and regulations for opening a brothel are also ambiguous and complex, and as a result, there are only 20 licensed brothels in Queensland. These facilities do not always have the capacity under their license to have more than a certain amount of sex workers in their employ and at any one time, and the ability to comply with strict health regulations due to discrimination from healthcare sector leave brothels vulnerable and picky about their employees. This in turn forces many individual workers to work alone, illegally, or underground. The decriminalisation of sex work could then see the introduction of individual licenses on top of brothel licenses and regulation that will better protect workers and the community at large. By being bound by certain rules and regulations means that the workforce itself in general will become a safer and more accountable place. As far as discrimination statistics go, the numbers speak for themselves. The statistics for violence and discrimination that are available are frightening look into the reality of sex workers face on a daily basis. The breakdown being that of approximately 451,813 sex workers, which is recorded by the Australian Bureau of Statistics at the last census on the 23rd of November 2021, means that all current data, studies and surveys have only been carried out on less than 1% of what is believed to be the total number of sex workers. Queensland is home to just 20 licensed brothels across the entire state. The same number, Respect Inc. estimate, would exist in a single electorate of Sydney. The rest of the industry accounting for between 80 and 90% of the sex workers in Queensland. They work outside of the licensed brothel sector in workplaces that are not eligible to be licensed or as independent operators, working alone, placing themselves at risk out of homes and hotels. If they are able to work legally, otherwise, it is estimated that 70% of these actually still work illegally. In 2020, a nationwide survey of nearly 650 sex workers run by Australia's peak sex worker organisation, the Scarlet Alliance, and the Centre for Social Research in Health, found 96% of workers reported experiencing stigma and discrimination related to their work within the last 12 months. A further 34% indicated this happened often and always, that is the discrimination, while 91% reported negative treatment towards them by health workers. When it comes to healthcare, nearly 60% of sex workers reported being discriminated against by a doctor or a GP trying to access regular, safe healthcare. Whilst the type of discrimination faced has not been discussed yet in detail, stories from sex workers that have been used in reports to report these legislative changes have reported that Queensland is only an Australian state that gives accommodation providers the power to illegally evict sex workers, refuse them accommodation, and demand more money if they believe the property is being used to sell sex. This is also true of access to healthcare, and there is a significant fear of being reported to police. But possibly the scariest statistic of all is that it is estimated that 100% of sex workers would report being exposed to violence, robbery, blackmail, and vilification by not only customers, but also the general public, landlords, and the healthcare sector. Even scarier is that of these experiences, only 10% is ever reported. The worst part is that the true number are likely worse and cannot be accurately reported on due to barriers in identifying sex workers because they are afraid to speak out. It is impossible to know the actual number of all women who have experienced sexual assault in the sex work industry, as which is stated in LAWS of 2003 and Phillip and Parks in 2006. Sexual violence is often unreported. Some victims and survivors may never disclose to anyone their experiences of violence, as stated in Ahrens of 2006. Like other victims and survivors of sexual assault, sex workers may be similarly reluctant to speak out. As this presentation discusses, where sex work is criminalised or stigmatised, workers are less likely to disclose incidences of sexual assault and simply put up with the subpar working conditions. In addition, an additional factor hampering adequate knowledge about sex workers' experiences relates to the limited nature of available research. Again, facing barriers in relation to reporting and how many sex workers wish to share their story so that with data and research and surveys, information can be gathered and collated. Sex workers in the employ of a licensed brothel are not free from experiences of violence and discrimination, with the majority of incidences still going unreported, irrespective of the work being conducted in a licensed premises, largely due to the fear of being discriminated against by police, the healthcare sector, or having the brothel that they work for investigated. These kind of statistics would not be tolerated by any other industry or licensed profession, and it is ludicrous to expect sex workers in Queensland to put up with the same and remain at risk. There is also another small factor group that needs to be considered, and that is migrant sex workers. It is not widely known, but Australia has a website which is called legalbrothelsaustralia.com. The site's specific heading, and with glamorous, flashy writing all across the screen, states, "Make great money whilst travelling by working in legal brothels in Australia." The site promises to assist migrant workers with obtaining visas, directing people to legal brothels, and generally glamorising the sex work industry as being a wonderful way to travel and make money legally in Australia. Leaving aside the complex issues surrounding the dark side of sex work and migrant workers. This site further highlights the need for a streamlined, safe, and regulated industry that protects workers. The site actually exists and is enticing people to engage in sex work in exchange for entry into Australia. The site is glamorising the industry and giving the impression of monetary reward and security when the reality is that they will likely be targeted by police, arrested, experience violence and discrimination, and unable to access healthcare or a standard of occupational health and safety services, possibly rejected from financial facilities and housing, be left completely vulnerable and alone without support. And the fact that these workers are migrants leaves them even more vulnerable on a grander scale than any natural citizen. If registered or licensing to perform sex work was commonplace in Queensland, it would also go towards protecting these kinds of migrant workers and people entering Australia for the purpose of sex work. Unfortunately, we still have attitudes and violence towards women, but we need to start focusing on humanising the sex worker. As the No Excuse for Abuse campaign preaches and becomes the benchmark for preventing violence against women and other minority groups, why is it that violence is accepted, tolerated, and ignored when it is committed against a sex worker? It is considered completely unacceptable towards hospital staff, paramedics, bar staff, and Centrelink employees, just to name a few. Yet it is almost as though the stigma surrounding sex workers does not entitle them to the same treatment or standard of workplace safety and regulation as other industries. It is almost as though sex workers are subhuman, deserving of the violence brought upon themselves in many people's opinions, being society believes that discrimination is okay simply because they choose to be sex workers. Regardless of the reason, sex work is enough for society to condemn a person rather than see them as any other industry worker worthy of safety and workplace standards. It is a legislative change that is long overdue in Queensland. Sex work needs to be decriminalised, and licensing regulation needs to be implemented for all sex workers and licence holders across Queensland. Sex work has already been decriminalised in New South Wales in 1995, while Victoria is amid a major legislative review and other jurisdictions have made moves to ease laws. The Northern Territory government has moved forward to completely decriminalise sex work in the time that Queensland has been waiting for a review, and the Victorian government has now announced publicly of its intention to decriminalise sex work in 2 stages by the end of 2023. We already have many licensed professions in high-risk industries that require regulations and licensing, and in return, these licenses give a certain guarantee to the consumer that the person performing the work is safe, capable, and competent. Let's take electricians and doctors in medical practices, for example. Doctors are required to hold specific malpractice insurance and perform work to a high and safe standard. The licensing of sex work, both individual and brothel specific, will ensure that sex workers maintain a specific standard of service and operating, possibly require them to hold insurance to maintain accountability, then in turn protect the worker with standard occupational health and safety and workplace legislation that works in their favour regarding their own personal safety, health and workplace benefits. Whilst it can be argued that you must hold a qualification to be a doctor or an electrician, etc., sex work still remains a high-risk industry, regardless of there existing a qualification to perform the work or not. That is, and it will have more benefits from licensing and regulation than for it to not have it. Whether society and the government wish to believe it or not, sex work as a profession continues to be a service based on supply and demand. The focus of stigma and ridicule has always been focused on the worker and never on the customer as a relative issue. Sex work is generally considered to be the oldest profession and for the most part is entered into freely as a conscious decision of the provider. There is and always will be a dark side to the industry, but that is true for any profession. But that does not make sex workers any less human or worthy of statutory professions, regulations, and the implementation of licensing. Everyone deserves to feel safe and happy at work, and this is no different for sex workers. The steps towards decriminalisation will lay the groundwork for not only the safety of workers, but also the health and safety of customers. It is clear from the research that licensing is something that needs to be seriously considered, both for individuals and for brothel holders. Under licensing, regulations, reviews, and also police powers and other government agencies' time, money, and expertise can be redirected towards a safer practice and workplace for all. Thank you.